Hello, night seekers, and welcome to Midnight Scary Storyteller, a place where forgotten tales and gentle voices guide you softly into sleep, wrapped in mystery and shadow. Before tonight's story begins, don't forget to subscribe and tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment below. I always love seeing where these midnight stories find their way. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's drift together into the unknown. When I was younger, I lived in two different houses that were both very old. Each one had its own history, and while I never thought much about that at first, I ended up having experiences in both homes that I've never been able to fully explain. Whether they were caused by vivid dreams, sleep-related phenomena, active imagination, or something else entirely, I honestly can't say. All I know is that both experiences felt incredibly real at the time, and they've stayed with me ever since. The first house was old enough that it always had a certain atmosphere about it. Like many older homes, it made the usual noises you'd expect. The floors creaked, the walls settled, and every now and then you'd hear sounds that were easy to dismiss as the house simply aging. One night, I woke up unexpectedly. The room was dark, except for the little bit of light filtering in from outside. As my eyes adjusted, I immediately noticed something standing in the corner of the bedroom. It looked like the outline of a man. I couldn't make out facial features or clothing. It was more like a dark human-shaped figure than a clearly visible person. The figure wasn't moving. It simply stood there. But I had an overwhelming feeling that it was looking directly at me. The emotion that came with seeing it is what I remember most clearly. It felt deeply unsettling. I've experienced moments before where I've sensed what I can only describe as an unusual presence. But this felt different. Much darker. Much heavier. There was an intense feeling of unease that seemed to fill the room. It wasn't simply fear from waking up unexpectedly. It felt as though the entire atmosphere had changed. Years before that experience, I had talked to my therapist about something similar. At the time, I had described sensing what I thought of as dark energy on another occasion, rather than dismissing my feelings outright. She shared something that had personally helped her. She told me that if I ever experienced that overwhelming feeling again, I should calmly say, "Only benevolent spirits are welcome here." She explained that she and her husband had once lived in a house where they experienced enough unusual events that they eventually asked a priest to bless the home. Whether someone interprets that advice spiritually or simply as a grounding exercise, it stayed with me. Lying there in bed, staring at the dark figure in the corner, I remembered exactly what she had said. So I spoke those words aloud. "Only benevolent spirits are welcome here." Then I quietly said a prayer, asking for protection. I don't remember anything dramatic happening afterward. The figure didn't slowly disappear. There wasn't any sudden noise. Nothing extraordinary occurred. I simply remember feeling calmer. Eventually, I was able to relax enough to fall back asleep. When morning came, everything was completely normal. The figure never returned. At least, I never saw it again in that house. Later, I told my children what had happened. I wasn't trying to frighten them. I simply mentioned the experience because it had been so vivid. That's when my son surprised me. He told me that something similar had happened to him. He said he had also seen what he believed was a dark figure. Hearing that immediately caught my attention. Part of me wondered whether living in the same house had influenced both of us. Children and parents often share stories, expectations, and even unconscious fears without realizing it. At the same time, hearing someone else describe something similar naturally made the experience feel more significant. Whether there was any actual connection, I can't honestly say. Eventually, we moved away. Years later, I found myself living in another old house. This one was even older. It was more than 125 years old. Like many historic homes, it had its own unique character. Beautiful architecture. Original woodwork. The kind of place that made you wonder how many families had lived there over the decades. One night, I accidentally fell asleep with the bedroom light still on. Sometime later, I woke up. The room was still illuminated. As soon as I opened my eyes, I realized I wasn't alone. Standing beside my bed was a small child. Unlike the dark figure from the first house, this child appeared completely different. He looked to be around 3 or 4 years old. He had blonde hair with large, curly ringlets. His clothing immediately stood out. He was wearing what looked like a sailor suit, the kind of outfit that was commonly worn by young children during the late 19th century. The clothes looked old-fashioned enough that they immediately caught my attention. The little boy wasn't frightening. In fact, he seemed almost peaceful. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't crying. He simply stood there, looking at me with quiet curiosity. I never felt threatened. There was no overwhelming sense of fear. Nothing about him felt hostile. If anything, he appeared just as interested in me as I was in him. For a few moments, we simply looked at one another. I wasn't panicking. Oddly enough, I felt surprisingly calm. Eventually, I reached over and turned off the light. Then, I lay back down. When I woke up again later, the little boy was gone. That was the only time I ever saw him. I've often thought about how different those two experiences felt. The first encounter filled me with dread. The second carried none of that feeling. If both experiences were products of dreaming, sleep paralysis, or some other sleep-related phenomenon, it's interesting how completely different the emotions were. One felt overwhelmingly dark. The other felt quiet and almost innocent. That's something I've never been able to explain. Both houses were located in the same city, Saginaw, Michigan. More specifically, they were only a few miles from the part of the city known as Old Town. At the time, I didn't think much about that. They were simply two old houses in the same general area. Years passed before I ever made another connection. Eventually, I came across a series of documentaries created by Steve Prozac Shippey that focused on stories and investigations involving allegedly haunted locations around Saginaw. One documentary in particular caught my attention. It was called A Haunting on Hamilton Street. As I watched it, I realized something surprising. Both of the houses where I'd had those experiences were located within only a couple of miles of the area featured in the documentary. I found that coincidence fascinating. Of course, proximity alone doesn't prove anything. Older neighborhoods naturally accumulate generations of local stories, folklore, and ghost tales. Historic homes often inspire curiosity because so many people have lived in them over the decades. It's easy for unusual experiences, whether ordinary or extraordinary, to become connected with those histories. I recognize that. At the same time, learning about those documentaries made me think back on my own experiences in a new way. Not because they confirmed anything. They didn't, but because they reminded me that I wasn't the only person who had associated that part of Saginaw with unusual stories. Looking back now, I try to approach both experiences with an open mind. There are well-documented psychological explanations for waking up and briefly seeing figures in a room. Sleep paralysis, hypnopompic hallucinations, and other sleep-related phenomena can produce experiences that feel remarkably real. Those explanations deserve serious consideration. Old houses also have a way of influencing the imagination. Their sounds, their history, and even the way light falls through old windows can create an atmosphere that feels mysterious. Memory itself changes over time as well. The older we get, the more our minds naturally organize unusual experiences into meaningful stories. I understand all of that. Even so, the memories remain vivid. I can still picture the dark figure standing silently in the corner of the first bedroom. I can still remember the overwhelming feeling of heaviness that filled the room. I remember speaking the words my therapist had suggested. I remember saying my prayer. And I remember feeling calm enough afterward to fall asleep. Just as clearly, I remember opening my eyes in the second house to find the small blonde boy quietly standing beside my bed. I remember his curls. I remember his old-fashioned sailor suit. Most of all, I remember how different the emotional atmosphere felt. There was no fear, only curiosity. I've never claimed to know exactly what I experienced. Maybe both events happened entirely within the strange space between sleeping and waking. Maybe they were vivid dreams that felt completely real. Maybe they were something connected to the history of those old homes. Or maybe they were experiences that simply don't fit neatly into any one explanation. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that both moments left a lasting impression on me. Years have passed since either of them happened. I've lived in other homes since then without experiencing anything similar. Still, every now and then, I'll think back to those two old houses in Saginaw. One gave me one of the darkest feelings I've ever experienced. The other gave me one of the strangest moments of quiet curiosity I've ever known. Whether those experiences were psychological, coincidental, or something beyond my understanding is a question I'll probably never be able to answer. But they've stayed with me all these years, becoming part of the collection of memories that continue to blur the line between what can easily be explained and what remains, at least for me, a mystery. When I was about 6 years old, something happened that my family still remembers because none of us could come up with a reasonable explanation for it. It happened late at night, sometime around midnight or maybe 1 in the morning. Everyone in the house had already gone to bed. The entire house was quiet, and nothing unusual had happened before we fell asleep. Then, without any warning, an incredibly loud noise echoed through the house. It was loud enough to wake almost everyone at the same time. I remember suddenly sitting up in bed, confused and still half asleep. Within seconds, I could hear other bedroom doors opening. My sister had woken up too, along with the rest of my family. Everyone seemed equally startled. For a few moments, nobody knew what had happened. The sound had clearly come from somewhere inside the house, most likely the living room. Still trying to wake up, we all slowly made our way out of our bedrooms and toward the source of the noise. The house felt strangely quiet after that single loud crash. No one was talking much. I think we were all expecting to find that something had simply fallen over. Maybe a picture frame, maybe a lamp, something ordinary. Instead, when we reached the living room, we found something none of us expected. Lying on the floor was a large brass candelabra that had been purchased not long before. It wasn't an old family heirloom or something that had been sitting around for years. It was relatively new. The candelabra had fallen onto the floor. That part alone wouldn't have been especially strange. What caught everyone's attention was its condition. It hadn't simply bent. It hadn't lost one of its arms. It hadn't cracked in an uneven way. It was split almost perfectly in half. I remember everyone just standing there for a moment, staring at it. Nobody said anything at first. We were all trying to process what we were looking at. Even as a 6-year-old, I could tell something about the situation felt wrong. My mother eventually stepped forward to examine it more closely. She picked up the 2 pieces and looked carefully at the break. I still remember the expression on her face. She looked genuinely shocked. According to her, the candelabra hadn't broken in the random, jagged way you would normally expect from something falling. It had separated almost perfectly down the middle. The split looked unusually clean. I didn't fully understand why that mattered at the time, but I could tell from everyone's reactions that they found it unsettling. The room remained quiet as everyone looked from the broken candelabra to one another. No one seemed to have an explanation. It wasn't just surprise. There was a noticeable feeling of uneasiness. Even as a child, I could sense that the adults were disturbed by what they were seeing. Normally, when something breaks in the middle of the night, someone immediately comes up with a practical explanation. Maybe it was unstable. Maybe someone accidentally bumped it earlier. Maybe it had simply fallen off the table. This time, nobody seemed confident enough to say any of those things. The break itself seemed to be what bothered everyone most. I don't remember anyone arguing about what had happened. I don't remember anyone blaming another family member. Instead, there was just confusion. Eventually, someone cleaned up the broken pieces, and life moved on. But the memory never really disappeared. Even though I was only 6 years old, that night stayed with me because of how unusual everyone's reaction was. Children often take emotional cues from adults. If the adults around you seem calm, you usually assume everything is fine. If they seem frightened or unsettled, you notice that too. That night, every face I looked at carried the same expression. Confusion, shock, a little fear. As I got older, I thought back on that experience many times. On its own, it's entirely possible there was an ordinary explanation. Metal objects can sometimes contain manufacturing flaws. Stress within the metal can occasionally cause unexpected failures. Perhaps the candelabra already had a hidden weakness that finally gave way. The loud crash may simply have been the moment it fell and broke. That's certainly one possibility. At the same time, the way my family reacted has always made the memories stand out. None of them seemed to think the break looked normal. Whether they were right or simply caught off guard, I can't really say. The event became even more memorable because it wasn't the only strange thing people associated with my grandmother's house. Over the years, there were other odd experiences that different family members talked about. Some were small. Others were more difficult to explain. Exactly what happened varied depending on who was telling the story, but enough unusual incidents occurred that people occasionally joked that Grandma's house had something strange about it. Whether those stories were connected or simply a collection of unrelated coincidences is impossible to know. Old houses often gather stories over time. Families naturally remember unusual events more vividly than ordinary ones. Once a place develops a mysterious reputation, people may pay closer attention to anything out of the ordinary. That's simply how memory and storytelling work. I recognize that now. Still, that particular night remains one of the clearest memories I have from early childhood. I can still picture all of us standing together in the living room in the middle of the night. The house was quiet, except for our footsteps. The broken brass candelabra lay on the floor between us. Everyone stared at it. No one seemed to know what to say. I remember looking at my parents' faces, expecting one of them to explain everything. Instead, they looked just as puzzled as I was. That may be the part that has stayed with me the longest. As children, we often believe adults have answers for everything. That night, they didn't. Years later, I've tried to approach the memory with a more balanced perspective. It's possible there was a completely natural cause. Perhaps the candelabra had a defect that no one noticed when it was purchased. Perhaps the impact of falling caused a break that only looked unusually clean. Memory also changes over time, especially memories from early childhood. I understand all of that. Even so, I still remember the sound that woke everyone. I remember the silence that followed. I remember seeing the broken candelabra lying on the floor, and I remember the unmistakable expressions on my family's faces as they tried to understand how a solid brass object had ended up split so cleanly in two. Whether it was nothing more than a rare material failure or something far more unusual, I honestly don't know. All I know is that, in the middle of the night, every member of my family was awakened by a tremendous crash. When we reached the living room, a recently purchased solid brass candelabra was lying on the floor, broken into two nearly perfect halves. No one could explain how it had happened. Considering the other strange stories that eventually became associated with my grandmother's house, it's easy to understand why this incident became one of the family's most unforgettable memories. To this day, whenever someone brings up unexplained experiences, this is one of the first stories that comes to mind. Not because I can prove anything supernatural happened, but because it's one of those rare moments where everyone witnessed the aftermath together. Everyone saw the same thing, and no one ever found an explanation that completely satisfied them. Sometimes the strangest memories aren't the ones where something impossible happens right in front of you. Sometimes they're the ones where all that's left behind is a mystery, a room full of confused faces, and a single question that nobody has ever been able to answer. For years, a woman from North Carolina carried a strange childhood memory that never made sense to her. It wasn't a clear memory or a complete story, just a brief image that would occasionally resurface, no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. She remembered being very young, around 5 years old, and somehow seeing her father's face inside the family's old outdoor privy. The memory felt impossible. As far as she had always been told, her father had simply abandoned the family when she was a little girl. Everyone accepted that explanation, and as the years passed, she learned to live with it. Still, that strange image never completely disappeared. Every now and then it would flash through her mind, leaving her confused because it didn't fit the story she had grown up believing. As an adult, she eventually began seeing a therapist. During counseling, she mentioned the recurring memory, explaining that she had never been able to understand why it continued to haunt her. According to accounts of the case, her therapist suggested hypnosis, or hypnotic regression, as a way to explore whether the memory represented something meaningful, or whether it was simply her mind trying to make sense of early childhood experiences. During those sessions, additional memories reportedly began to surface. One memory stood out more than the others. She recalled waking up during the night and walking into the family's kitchen. There, she remembered seeing her mother on the floor, cleaning up what appeared to be blood. According to her recollection, her mother immediately became angry after realizing she was awake and ordered her to go straight back to bed. For decades, those memories had remained buried or fragmented. On their own, they didn't prove anything. Childhood memories, especially ones recovered many years later, can be unreliable, and investigators generally treat them with caution. Still, the details were unsettling enough that they eventually drew the attention of local law enforcement. By that point, the woman's mother was still living on the same family farm. As more details emerged from the woman's recollections, investigators reportedly began comparing them with the family's history. Eventually, they believed there was enough information to justify taking a closer look at the property. Authorities obtained a search warrant. One of the places they focused on was the location where the old outdoor privy had once stood decades earlier. When investigators began digging beneath the site, they made a shocking discovery. Human remains were found buried where the old privy had been. The remains were identified as the woman's father. According to reports from the time, investigators believed his body had been dismembered before being placed into the pit, likely because that was the only practical way to conceal him inside such a confined space. The discovery completely changed the family's story. For decades, everyone had believed, or had been told, that the father had abandoned his wife and children without looking back. Instead, investigators now believed he had never left the property at all. He had allegedly remained there the entire time, hidden beneath the old privy while decades passed overhead. The case quickly became major local news. This all happened before the internet and social media, so people followed each development through newspapers and television reports. Every new article revealed another piece of the mystery, and residents closely watched to see whether prosecutors would move forward with criminal charges. The investigation raised countless questions. What had actually happened all those years earlier? Had the killing been planned, or had it resulted from a violent argument? Had anyone else known the truth? How had such a secret remained hidden for so many decades? Authorities continued trying to reconstruct events that had allegedly taken place many years before. Witnesses had aged, memories had faded, and much of the physical evidence had long since disappeared. Prosecutors faced the difficult challenge of determining whether there was enough remaining evidence to successfully bring the case to trial. Then, before those questions could be answered in court, the story took another tragic turn. According to reports, the elderly mother, who was in her 70s by that time, left the farmhouse one day carrying a pistol. She drove out to a remote area of the family property. There, she died from what authorities determined was a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Her death effectively ended any possibility of a criminal prosecution. With the primary suspect gone, many of the questions surrounding the case would likely never receive definitive answers. Even today, the story continues to circulate because it combines several extraordinary elements into one case: a decades-old disappearance, a childhood memory that resurfaced years later, the discovery of hidden human remains on a family farm, and an investigation that ended before it ever reached a courtroom. At the same time, it's worth remembering that recovered memories, especially those obtained through hypnotic regression, are considered controversial. Modern psychologists and legal experts generally advise treating such memories with caution, because hypnosis can increase confidence in memories without necessarily increasing their accuracy. For that reason, investigators typically rely on physical evidence and independent corroboration rather than hypnosis alone. In this case, the excavation of the old privy reportedly provided the physical evidence that transformed what had once been only a disturbing childhood memory into a homicide investigation. Whether every detail of the woman's recollections was accurate may never be known. What is known is that investigators found her father's remains exactly where they eventually decided to search. The discovery revealed that a man who had supposedly walked away from his family decades earlier had, in reality, never left the farm at all. His disappearance had remained a mystery for years, hidden beneath the ground in a place few people would ever think to look, until one daughter's fragmented childhood memories led investigators back to the property and uncovered a secret that had been buried for decades. When I was growing up, my mom worked in a prison. She wasn't a correctional officer or a guard. She worked in the education department, teaching inmates and helping them earn qualifications while they served their sentences. Even though she wasn't directly responsible for security, her job still meant she spent every day around people who had committed some truly terrible crimes. As a kid, I never really understood what that meant. To me, It was just where my mom went to work every morning. One thing always stood out from that time, though. For a while, my mom suddenly became very strict about how my sister and I wore our hair. She wouldn't let either of us wear it in ponytails anymore. If our hair was long, she insisted we leave it down whenever we went out. At the time, she never explained why. I was a complete tomboy, and I absolutely hated having my hair down. It got in my face whenever I ran around or played outside. I constantly complained because I wanted to tie it back like every other kid my age. Eventually, after hearing me argue about it enough times, my mom gave in and let me cut my hair short instead. Once it was short, there was no need for a ponytail anymore, and that seemed to satisfy her. I thought it was a strange rule, but kids don't usually question their parents forever. Eventually, I stopped thinking about it. Years later, after I was grown up, I finally learned the real reason behind it. My mom told me that around the same time she had started enforcing that rule, a new inmate had arrived at the prison where she worked. He wasn't there for theft or assault. He had committed a crime so horrifying that even after all those years, my mom still struggled to talk about it. According to what she told me, the man had murdered his own 5-year-old daughter after subjecting her to unimaginable abuse. The details were horrific. He assaulted the little girl with a beer bottle, and during the attack, the bottle shattered, causing catastrophic injuries. Instead of getting help, he left her to die from her injuries. After she died, he wrapped her body inside a carpet and hid her in the attic of the house, apparently believing no one would find her. Eventually, he was caught while trying to move the body, and the crime was uncovered. Just hearing that story years later made me feel sick. But what disturbed my mother even more wasn't only the crime itself, it was the man. Because of her job in the prison's education department, she occasionally had interactions with inmates during classes or educational programs. She wasn't friends with them, of course, but she couldn't completely avoid hearing them talk. This inmate apparently liked talking about his daughter, not with guilt, not with regret. He referred to her as his girl. He would describe how beautiful she had been and talk about her in a way that made everyone around him deeply uncomfortable. According to my mom, one subject kept coming up over and over again: the back of her neck. He would talk about how pretty it looked when little girls wore their hair tied up. He described how delicate the back of the neck was, how much he liked seeing it exposed, and how easy it was to grab someone by their ponytail. The conversations weren't emotional confessions. They were unsettling observations delivered almost casually, as though he saw nothing wrong with what he was saying. My mom told me that hearing those comments changed something inside her. Every day at work, she was forced to listen to someone capable of thinking that way. Then she'd come home and see her own daughters with their hair tied up exactly the way he had described. She knew, logically, that there was no connection between us and him. She knew he was locked behind prison walls. But emotions don't always follow logic. She simply couldn't stand looking at us wearing ponytails anymore. It wasn't because she believed we were in danger from that particular inmate. It wasn't because she thought hairstyles actually caused harm. It was because every time she saw the back of our necks exposed, she immediately remembered the disgusting things that man had said. Those images followed her home from work. She never wanted us connected, even accidentally, to something that reminded her of him. As a child, I interpreted it as another one of those random parenting rules that never made sense. Parents often make decisions kids don't understand, and I figured this was just one more example. Looking back now, I realize it had nothing to do with control. It was trauma. My mom spent her days surrounded by people most of us hope we never meet in our entire lives. She listened to stories, saw case files, and encountered offenders whose crimes were almost impossible to comprehend. Even though She wasn't a prison guard. Simply working in that environment exposed her to things that stayed with her long after she came home. I imagine she tried her best to leave work at work. But some things don't stay behind prison walls. Some conversations follow you home. Some faces linger in your memory. Some words replay in your head long after you've heard them. As a parent herself, hearing someone describe his own child that way must have been unbearable. Instead of talking to my sister and me about it, which obviously wouldn't have been appropriate for young children, she did the only thing she felt she could do. She changed our hairstyles. At the time, I thought she was being unfair. I argued. I complained. I begged to wear my hair however I wanted. Now that I'm older, I wish I could go back and tell her I understood. She wasn't trying to punish us. She was trying to protect her own peace of mind. Sometimes people assume that working in a prison only affects correctional officers, but that's far from true. Teachers, counselors, medical staff, psychologists, and administrative employees are all exposed to the same offenders. Even if they aren't responsible for security, they're still confronted with the reality of what some people are capable of. That kind of exposure leaves marks you can't always see. You don't come home with cuts or bruises. You come home carrying memories. You carry conversations you'd rather forget. You carry details that replay without warning. For my mom, one of those details became something as ordinary as a child's ponytail. It's strange how trauma can attach itself to something completely innocent. To everyone else, a little girl with her hair tied back is just a child ready for school or playing outside on a warm afternoon. To my mom, during that period of her life, it became a painful reminder of one of the most disturbing people she had ever encountered. She never explained it while we were children, because there was no reason to burden us with something so horrifying. Instead, she quietly changed one small part of our daily routine. Only years later did I finally understand why. I still think about that conversation from time to time, not because of the inmate himself. I honestly don't care to remember people like that, but because it changed the way I viewed my mother. As a kid, I only saw a parent making a rule that didn't make any sense. As an adult, I saw someone carrying the emotional weight of her job while doing everything she could to keep that darkness from reaching her children. She couldn't erase what she had heard. She couldn't forget what that man had said. But she could look at her daughters and try, in whatever small way she knew how, to separate them from those memories. Back then, I thought cutting my hair short was simply a victory because it meant I no longer had to wear it down. Now I realize it was probably a relief for her too. It meant she no longer had to see something that brought back one of the worst conversations she'd ever been forced to endure. It's amazing how children can go years without understanding the reasons behind their parents' behavior. We often assume they're being strict, overprotective, or unreasonable. Sometimes, though, those decisions come from experiences we know nothing about. Sometimes they're carrying burdens they hope we never have to understand. Looking back now, I don't remember the arguments about my hair nearly as much as I remember finally learning the truth. And once I knew the reason, that simple childhood memory stopped being about hairstyles altogether. It became a reminder that some jobs leave emotional scars no one else can see. And sometimes the smallest changes people make at home are their quiet way of coping with things they wish they had never witnessed in the first place. A few years ago, I lost a close friend to what was later confirmed to be a drug overdose. At the time this happened, though, none of us knew the truth yet. He had simply disappeared, and everyone around him was still trying to figure out what had happened. Those days were filled with uncertainty. People were calling each other, sending messages, and hoping someone had heard from him. Every new rumor seemed to contradict the last one. Part of me wanted to believe he would eventually show up and explain everything, while another part feared something terrible had happened. A couple of days after he disappeared, I had one of the most vivid dreams of my life. Even now, years later, I can remember it with incredible detail. It didn't feel like an ordinary dream. It felt intense, almost painfully real. The sounds, the emotions, and even the conversations felt sharper than any dream I'd ever had before. The first thing I remember is desperately calling his name. I wasn't simply shouting, I was screaming as loudly as I possibly could, again and again. I kept yelling his name with everything I had, trying to find him. The effort felt so real that my throat actually hurt inside the dream. Every scream felt physically painful, as though I had been shouting for hours. I couldn't see where he was. I just knew I had to keep searching. Eventually, after what felt like a very long time, I finally found him. He wasn't alone. He was standing in what looked like a line. I couldn't tell where the line began or where it ended. It simply stretched farther than I could see. The people standing around him immediately caught my attention. They weren't exactly people. They had human shapes, but they didn't have faces. No eyes, no mouths, no recognizable features at all. Each one looked like the outline of a person, but without any real identity. It was deeply unsettling. Despite everything strange about the place, my attention stayed focused on my friend. The moment I saw him, I felt an enormous sense of relief. He looked back at me with an expression that I still remember clearly. He seemed confused. He also looked scared. But there was something else about his expression. It felt like he was trying very hard not to show how frightened he actually was. Almost like someone pretending everything was okay because they didn't want to worry anyone else. That was exactly how he had often behaved in real life. He would hide his struggles behind a calm face. Seeing that same expression in the dream made everything feel even more real. The first thing I asked him was simple. "Are you okay?" He answered almost immediately. Yeah, but something about the answer didn't convince me. He said he was okay, yet he still looked uncertain. It felt like he wanted me to believe him, even if he wasn't completely sure himself. Then he said something that I've never forgotten. He told me he wasn't alone. As he said it, he pointed toward the faceless figures standing beside him. The moment he pointed at them, every one of them turned toward me. I can't explain why that moment frightened me so much. None of them moved aggressively. None of them spoke. They simply turned their attention toward me all at once. The atmosphere instantly changed. Until then, I'd been completely focused on my friend. Now I suddenly felt as though I wasn't supposed to be there. It was an overwhelming feeling. Not exactly fear. More like I had entered a place where I didn't belong. It felt deeply unwelcome. My friend seemed surprised that I had somehow found him, almost as though he hadn't expected me to be there at all. He started talking. I don't remember exactly what he was about to say. I've tried for years to remember his words, but that part of the dream has always remained just out of reach. I only remember that he had just begun speaking. Then everything ended instantly. A loud crash echoed through my house. It sounded like a door slamming with incredible force. The noise was so loud that it pulled me awake immediately. I sat straight up in bed. My heart was racing. For several seconds, I honestly wasn't sure whether I was awake or still dreaming. The dream had felt unbelievably real. Not only visually real, emotionally real. Even the sounds inside the dream seemed unusually loud and vivid. It took me a few moments to gather myself. Eventually, I got out of bed and checked the house. I expected to find that a window had blown open or that someone had slammed a door. Everything seemed normal. I couldn't immediately find anything that explained the noise. The whole experience stayed with me throughout the day. At the time, I still didn't know what had happened to my friend. I just couldn't shake the feeling that the dream had been different from any I'd ever had before. Not long afterward, we learned the truth. He had died from a drug overdose. Hearing that news completely changed the way I remembered the dream. Suddenly, every detail felt heavier. The line, the faceless figures, his expression, the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. Whether those details meant anything beyond my own subconscious is something I honestly can't answer. I've thought about it many times over the years. Part of me believes the dream may simply have been my mind trying to process uncertainty. Even before we officially learned about his death, perhaps some part of me already feared the worst. Our brains are remarkably good at piecing together subtle clues without us consciously realizing it. Dreams often combine emotions, memories, and fears into stories that feel incredibly meaningful. That explanation makes a lot of sense. At the same time, it's difficult to ignore how unusually vivid the experience was. I've had countless dreams throughout my life. Most disappear from memory within hours. This one never did. I still remember screaming his name. I still remember finally finding him. I still remember his face. I remember asking whether he was okay. I remember him saying he wasn't alone. Most of all, I remember those faceless figures turning toward me the instant he pointed at them. That image has never faded. I've also wondered about the loud door slam that woke me up. Maybe someone in the house really did close a door. Maybe a draft caused it. Maybe the sound itself became incorporated into the dream at the exact moment I was waking up. Something sleep researchers know can happen. That's entirely possible. The timing certainly fits. Even so, the transition from the dream to waking felt seamless enough that it's always stood out in my memory. I'm careful not to claim that the dream was supernatural. There are many perfectly reasonable explanations. Grief, anxiety, subconscious awareness, and the strange ways our minds process uncertainty during sleep can create experiences that feel astonishingly real. I recognize all of that. Still, I can't deny how profoundly the dream affected me. It didn't feel symbolic while I was inside it. It felt like a conversation. It felt like I'd actually found him somewhere. Whether that feeling came entirely from my own mind or from something beyond my understanding is something I'll probably never know. Sometimes I think about the expression on his face more than anything else. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't panicking. He simply looked like someone trying to stay strong in a place he didn't fully understand. That image has stayed with me ever since. Whenever people ask if I've ever experienced something I couldn't explain, this is usually the first story that comes to mind. Not because I can prove it meant anything supernatural. I can't. Maybe it was simply the mind's extraordinary ability to prepare us for painful news before we're consciously ready to accept it. Or maybe it was one final encounter with someone I cared about before learning the truth. I'll never know which explanation is correct. What I do know is that I've never had another dream quite like it. It remains the loudest, most vivid, and most emotionally intense dream I've ever experienced. Even now, years later, I can still picture that endless line of silent figures, my friend standing among them looking surprised to see me, and the overwhelming feeling that I had stepped into a place where I was never meant to be. Then, just as he began to speak, everything was interrupted by the violent sound of a door slamming somewhere in my house, pulling me back into the waking world before I could hear whatever it was he was about to say. To this day, that's the part I think about the most. Not what I saw, not even how real it felt, but the words I never got to hear. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, my family took a trip to a small family park in South Georgia. It wasn't a real lake. It was a large man-made pond that someone had dug out and turned into a place where families could spend the day. The owner had covered the shoreline with soft beach sand, planted palm trees to make it feel like a tropical getaway, and charged admission for people to come in. Families would pull up in their cars, unload coolers and grills, spend hours swimming in the water, and enjoy the afternoon together. To a kid my age, it felt like a huge adventure every time we went there. The place wasn't exactly known for being the safest attraction around. There was a giant water slide that looked exciting from a distance, but it seemed like someone was always getting hurt on it. Every visit, you could hear kids crying after wiping out or see parents rushing over to check on them. Looking back now as an adult, I'm surprised it was ever allowed to stay open. At the time, though, none of us thought much about it. We were kids, and all we cared about was getting into the water. My family always parked in the same area whenever we visited. Straight out from where we set up was a tiny sand island, sitting maybe 30 yards from the shoreline. It wasn't much more than a raised patch of sand sticking out of the water, but it felt like its own little destination. Kids would swim out to it, climb up for a minute, then jump back into the water before heading to shore again. I wasn't a particularly strong swimmer back then. Deep water made me nervous, but luckily the water between the shore and the island wasn't too deep. It was just a little higher than my head. I had figured out that if I pushed off the bottom with my feet, I could bounce my way across instead of actually swimming the whole distance. I'd dip underwater, push off the muddy bottom, pop back up for air, then repeat the process until I reached the island. It made me feel braver than I actually was. One afternoon, I decided to head out there again like I had done before. Everything seemed completely normal. Families were laughing, people were grilling food, children were splashing around, and the whole place had that loud, happy summer atmosphere. I started bouncing across the water toward the island. Then something happened that I have never been able to forget. As I pushed off the bottom with one foot, it landed on something that immediately felt wrong. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't a log. It wasn't soft mud either. For just a split second, it felt exactly like I had stepped on someone's face. I remember feeling what seemed like a nose pressing against my toes before my foot slipped away. Then something else brushed across my foot. Hair. Long, fine hair drifting through the water. Even after all these years, that's the part that has stayed with me more than anything else. I can still remember the sensation of those strands moving between my toes with the gentle motion of the water. It wasn't tangled or rough. It floated freely, almost weightless, and that strange feeling instantly filled me with panic. I jerked my foot away as fast as I could and scrambled toward the surface. I don't remember screaming, but I remember feeling completely terrified. Every instinct told me something wasn't right. I hurried back toward the shoreline as fast as I could, bouncing through the water without looking back. By the time I reached the beach, I wanted nothing to do with going back into the lake. I just sat there on the sand. At 7 or 8 years old, I couldn't process what had happened. Kids don't automatically jump to the worst possible conclusion. I convinced myself that maybe it had been weeds, or maybe I'd stepped on something strange lying at the bottom. I tried not to think about it, even though the feeling wouldn't leave my mind. For a while, everything around me continued like normal. People kept swimming. Children kept laughing. Parents kept talking. Then, the atmosphere suddenly changed. I remember hearing adults calling out a little boy's name. At first it sounded like any parent trying to find their child after they had wandered off. That happened all the time at crowded parks. But the voices kept getting louder. More people joined in. Soon, parents were walking quickly along the shoreline, shouting the same name over and over. You could hear the fear creeping into their voices. People started asking each other if anyone had seen the missing boy. The laughter slowly disappeared. The fun atmosphere was gone. Everyone seemed to realize something was wrong. People began searching the water. Adults waded farther out, scanning beneath the surface while others looked around the beach. Conversation stopped as everyone focused on finding the missing child. I remember sitting there quietly, watching everything unfold without really understanding what was happening. Then someone found him. His body was pulled from the water. It was right there, underneath the water near that little sand island where I had been only a short time earlier. The exact place where I had felt something beneath my foot. As a child, I didn't fully connect everything in that moment. I don't even remember anyone asking me if I had seen anything unusual. Maybe nobody knew where I had been. Maybe they assumed I had just been another kid playing in the water. Only later did the horrible realization begin to settle in. The thing I had stepped on, it almost certainly hadn't been a rock. It hadn't been driftwood. It hadn't been underwater plants. It had been the missing boy. That realization has stayed with me for decades. I'm 47 years old now, and there are countless childhood memories that have faded over time. I've forgotten birthdays, vacations, names of old classmates, and hundreds of other moments that once seemed important. But I have never forgotten that feeling. Sometimes memories fade around the edges until they're almost impossible to picture clearly. This one never did. If I close my eyes today, I can still remember bouncing through that water. I can remember my foot coming down. I can remember that brief moment of pressure against what felt like a nose. Most of all, I remember the hair. It drifted so naturally through the water that there was nothing dramatic about it. That almost makes it worse. It wasn't tangled around my foot or grabbing at me like something from a horror movie. It simply floated between my toes with the slow movement of the water before I instinctively pulled away. It's amazing how a single physical sensation can stay locked in your memory for an entire lifetime. I've experienced far more important events since then. I've gone through school, work, relationships, and all the ordinary ups and downs of life. Yet somehow that tiny detail has never disappeared. I don't think about it every day, but every now and then something brings it back. Swimming in a lake. Walking through water where I can't see the bottom. Feeling weeds brush against my legs. Even seeing children playing at crowded beaches can remind me of that afternoon. For just a second, I'm that frightened little kid again, frozen on the shoreline and trying to understand why something felt so terribly wrong. Looking back as an adult, I also think about those parents. At the time, all I really noticed was that they were scared. I remember hearing them desperately calling their son's name over and over, asking strangers if anyone had seen him. Their voices carried across the water, becoming more frantic with every minute that passed. As a child, I couldn't fully understand what they were feeling. As an adult, I can't imagine the terror of realizing your child is missing near the water. Every second must have felt endless. Every unanswered call would have made the fear even worse. Then came the moment nobody ever wants to experience. The search ended. Not with relief, but with heartbreak. I don't know anything about that little boy beyond what happened that day. I don't know his name anymore. I don't know how long he had been underwater before anyone realized he was missing. I don't know exactly how the accident happened. What I do know is that, without realizing it, I crossed paths with one of the saddest moments of someone else's life. At 7 or 8 years old, I had no way of understanding it. Now, decades later, I understand far more than I wish I did. People often talk about memories they can never erase. Usually it's because of something they saw. Mine isn't really visual. It's physical. A single sensation. Hair drifting gently through the water between my toes. Nearly 40 years have passed since that summer day at a small man-made lake in South Georgia. And out of everything I remember from my childhood, that feeling remains clearer than almost anything else. Some memories fade. That one never did. The strangest experience I've ever had happened on the night my dad passed away. I've gone over that night in my mind countless times, trying to figure out whether there was a logical explanation for everything that happened. Maybe there was. Old houses can behave in strange ways, and grief can make certain moments feel even more significant. Still, even after all these years, I can't completely explain what my mom and I experienced. At the time, my dad was receiving hospice care at home. His health had declined to the point where staying in familiar surroundings was the best option for him, so we had moved his bed into the living room on the ground floor. It made caring for him much easier since he no longer had to deal with stairs. The house itself was incredibly old. It was a Victorian-style home that had been built sometime in the 1800s. Like many houses from that era, it had beautiful hardwood floors, tall ceilings, thick wooden doors, and all the little quirks that come with a building that's been standing for more than a century. It was also very drafty. You could often feel cold air moving through parts of the house even when all the windows were closed. Doors would occasionally shift on their own, and the old wood seemed to creak constantly. We were used to those kinds of noises, and after living there for a while, they barely caught our attention anymore. That evening, my mom and I were upstairs cleaning while my dad rested downstairs in the living room. We wanted to get a few things done while everything was quiet. Earlier in the day, we had taken one of the interior doors off its hinges and leaned it against a doorway to block off part of the space. It wasn't secured with anything. It was simply resting against the frame, although it seemed stable enough that neither of us expected it to move. The door itself was solid wood. It was extremely heavy. If something like that were to fall onto hardwood flooring, it wouldn't be a quiet event. It would create an enormous crash that would probably echo throughout the entire house. While we were upstairs, however, we didn't hear anything. No loud bang, no sound of wood striking the floor, no noise that suggested anything unusual had happened downstairs. Eventually, we finished cleaning and headed back downstairs. As soon as we reached the first floor, we both noticed something immediately. The heavy wooden door that had been leaning against the doorway was now lying flat on the hardwood floor. For a moment, neither of us said anything. We just stared at it. The first thing that crossed my mind wasn't that it had fallen. It was wondering how in the world we hadn't heard it. A door that heavy should have made an incredible amount of noise when it hit the floor. Instead, there had been complete silence. That wasn't the only strange part. Our cat had been sleeping on a chair right beside my dad's bed the entire time. Normally, if something that heavy crashed onto a hardwood floor nearby, I would have expected him to bolt across the room, or at least wake up in surprise. Instead, he hadn't reacted at all. He was still peacefully lying there, as though nothing unusual had happened. That detail has always stayed with me, curious. My mom and I started walking around the house to see if anything else was out of place. Since the house was known for being drafty, we wondered if perhaps a strong gust of air had somehow knocked the door over. As we checked the downstairs rooms, we discovered something else. The basement door was standing wide open. It looked as though it had been blown open. That immediately caught our attention because the basement door was usually kept closed. Seeing it open at the same time the heavy wooden door had somehow ended up on the floor made the whole situation feel even stranger. We didn't know what to make of it. Maybe the drafts in the house had created enough pressure to move both doors. It sounded possible, even if it seemed unusual. There wasn't much else we could do except continue focusing on my dad. About 30 minutes later, he passed away. No matter how much time you have to prepare for losing someone, the moment it actually happens is incredibly difficult. The house became very quiet afterward. There was a silence that felt almost overwhelming. Wanting some support, I called a close friend and asked if they could come over. I didn't want my mom and me to go through the rest of the evening alone. After making the call, we stayed together in the living room where my dad had spent his final moments. We sat quietly, waiting for my friend to arrive. Not long afterward, we heard knocking. It sounded exactly like someone knocking on the front door. Both my mom and I looked toward the entrance at the same time. We assumed my friend had arrived much sooner than expected. I got up immediately and walked to the front door. When I opened it, there was nobody there. The porch was empty. The yard was empty. There wasn't anyone walking away. I looked around for a few moments before closing the door again. As I walked back toward the living room, the knocking started again. Only this time, it seemed different. Instead of clearly coming from the front door, it almost sounded as though it was moving through the house. The sound seemed to come from different directions. It was difficult to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. Both my mom and I heard it. We even looked at each other, because we each thought the other was hearing the same thing. It wasn't just me imagining it. Eventually, my friend really did arrive. This time there was an actual knock at the front door, followed by someone waiting outside. But the earlier knocking remained completely unexplained. To this day, that's still the strangest experience I've ever had in that house. Part of me has always believed it was my dad's way of saying goodbye one last time. I know there's no way to prove something like that. It's simply how the experience felt to me. I've also spent years considering more ordinary explanations. Old Victorian homes can be unpredictable. Air pressure changes can move doors. Foundations settle. Wood expands and contracts. Heavy objects can occasionally shift in unexpected ways. There are also psychological factors to consider. The night a loved one dies is one of the most emotionally intense experiences a person can go through. Stress, exhaustion, and grief can all affect how we interpret unusual events and how vividly we remember them afterward. I recognize all of that. Still, there are details I find difficult to forget. The heavy wooden door lying on the floor without either of us hearing it fall. The cat sleeping peacefully beside my dad without reacting. The basement door standing open. The unexplained knocking that both my mother and I heard. Even if every one of those events had a perfectly logical explanation, experiencing them all on the same night left a lasting impression. The history of the house only added to the feeling that something about it was different. It had been standing since the 19th century, and over the years I'd heard stories that families in homes like ours used their front living rooms as funeral parlors before modern funeral homes became common. I never researched whether that specifically applied to our house, but it was interesting to think that generations before us may have gathered in that very room to say goodbye to loved ones. There was another tragedy connected to the house as well. Years before, my dad's significant other had unexpectedly taken her own life there. Knowing that history made the house feel emotionally heavy long before the night my father passed away. Living there was never particularly comfortable. It wasn't because I constantly saw strange things. It was more the feeling the house gave me. Doors would somehow end up open when I was certain I'd closed them. Kitchen cupboards often seemed to be standing open for no obvious reason. Sometimes it honestly felt like I spent more time closing doors and cabinets than opening them. Again, there are practical explanations for those things. Old houses settle. Uneven floors can cause doors to swing open. Loose latches don't always stay closed. I understand that. Even so, the atmosphere inside that house always felt different from anywhere else I'd lived. It carried a strange sense of unease that I could never quite explain. Whenever people ask if I've ever experienced something that felt paranormal, this is the story I always think about first. Not because I can prove that anything supernatural happened. I can't. There may be perfectly reasonable explanations for every event that took place that night. But when I remember those final hours with my dad, I don't think about each strange occurrence individually. I remember the entire sequence. My mom and I quietly cleaning upstairs, coming downstairs to find a heavy wooden door lying on the floor without having heard it fall, discovering the basement door standing wide open, sitting beside my dad during his final moments, hearing mysterious knocking that both of us believed was someone arriving at the front door, and then realizing there was no one there. Whether those events were nothing more than remarkable coincidences or something I'll never fully understand is impossible to say. Maybe the old house was simply behaving like old houses often do. Maybe grief made every unusual detail feel more meaningful than it otherwise would have. Or maybe, just maybe, my dad found one final way to let us know he was at peace before saying goodbye. I'll probably never know the answer. What I do know is that I've never forgotten that night. The old Victorian house is just another building now, but whenever I think back to those final hours with my father, I remember more than the sadness of losing him. I remember a series of strange events that neither my mother nor I could explain, and a feeling that, for just one night, the house itself seemed to share in saying farewell. I was 17 years old when something happened that I've never been able to explain. It took place not long after my grandfather passed away, during a time when my entire family was still adjusting to the loss. His death had affected all of us in different ways. The house felt quieter than usual, and there was a heaviness that seemed to linger for weeks afterward. Looking back now, I know grief can influence the way we think, feel, and even perceive the world around us. At the time, though, I wasn't thinking about any of that. To me, it was just another ordinary morning. It was sometime in June, and because summer was beginning, the sun was already rising fairly early. My alarm was set for 7 o'clock, but I often woke up naturally a few minutes before it went off. That morning was no different. I was in that strange state between sleeping and being fully awake. Not dreaming exactly, but not completely conscious either. As I slowly became more aware of my surroundings, I had an overwhelming sense that someone was standing in my bedroom. It wasn't just a vague feeling. I was convinced someone was there. The person seemed to be standing in the corner of my room near the bedroom door. I couldn't clearly see them because my eyes were still closed, but somehow I felt their presence so strongly that I didn't question it. In fact, I immediately assumed I knew who it was. I thought it was my mother. The idea made perfect sense in the moment. She wasn't someone who regularly checked on me while I slept, but the circumstances had been unusual lately. We had all been grieving after losing my grandfather, her father, and I figured maybe she'd woken up early, gone to the bathroom, and decided to quietly look in on me before going back to bed. It didn't seem strange. If anything, it felt comforting. I imagined her standing quietly by the door, just making sure I was okay. The feeling lasted for several moments. It wasn't frightening. I never felt threatened. It simply felt as though someone was standing there, watching over me. Eventually, I opened my eyes. The room was already beginning to fill with the soft light of early morning. Because it was June, there was enough daylight coming through the window that I could see almost everything clearly. I turned toward the corner where I believed my mother was standing. No one was there. The corner was completely empty. For a second, I simply stared. I was genuinely confused. The certainty I'd felt only moments earlier had been so strong that I expected to see someone standing exactly where I'd sensed them. Instead, there was nothing. My first thought wasn't anything supernatural. I assumed she must have quietly stepped away just before I opened my eyes. Maybe she'd already gone back to her bedroom. The timing seemed possible. Still puzzled, I got out of bed and walked into the hallway. Our bedrooms weren't far apart, so it only took a few seconds to reach my parents' room. I went over to my mother's side of the bed and quietly called her name. She didn't respond. I called again. Still nothing. Eventually, I had to wake her up. It wasn't the kind of response someone gives when they've just returned from walking around the house. She was deeply asleep. The kind of sleep where it takes several attempts before someone even understands that they're being spoken to. I remember having to repeat my question multiple times. At least 3 times. Maybe more. She was so groggy that she couldn't immediately understand what I was asking. Finally, after she woke up enough to respond, I asked whether she'd just been standing in my room. She looked completely confused. She told me she hadn't. In fact, judging by how deeply she'd been sleeping, it was obvious she hadn't been awake recently at all. That realization caught me off guard. If she hadn't been in my room, then why had I been so certain that someone was standing there? I remember going back to my room, still trying to make sense of it. The feeling had been incredibly convincing. It hadn't seemed dreamlike. It hadn't felt vague. For those few moments between sleeping and waking, I genuinely believed another person was quietly standing near my bedroom door. The experience never repeated itself. Not in that house. Not anywhere else. It happened only that one morning. As the years passed, I found myself thinking about it from different perspectives. The timing naturally stands out. It happened only a short while after my grandfather died. Because of that, part of me has occasionally wondered whether the experience somehow had something to do with him. Grief has a way of making us search for meaning, especially after losing someone close. Many people report unusual experiences following the death of a loved one, whether it's sensing their presence, dreaming about them vividly, or feeling as though they're nearby. Those experiences are surprisingly common. At the same time, there are also well-established psychological explanations. Sleep researchers describe something called hypnopompic hallucinations, vivid sensory experiences that can occur while transitioning from sleep to wakefulness. People sometimes see figures, hear voices, or feel another person's presence in the room, all while believing they're fully awake. These experiences can feel astonishingly real. Knowing that has helped me understand that there are entirely natural explanations for what happened. Still, understanding the science doesn't erase how convincing the experience felt. What has always stayed with me wasn't seeing someone. I never actually saw a figure standing there. It was the certainty, the absolute conviction that another person was quietly watching over me from the corner of the room. That feeling was so strong that I never questioned it. Not until I opened my eyes. Even then, I assumed my mother had simply left a moment earlier. Only after waking her from such a deep sleep did I realize that explanation didn't fit. I've replayed the morning countless times over the years. Could I simply have awakened while still partially dreaming? Absolutely. That may very well be what happened. The human brain is capable of producing incredibly vivid sensations during those transitions between sleeping and waking. It's one of the most reasonable explanations. On the other hand, I can't completely dismiss how unusual the timing felt. Losing my grandfather had affected our entire family emotionally. Whether that emotional state contributed to the experience psychologically, or whether it meant something else, is impossible to know. I've never claimed that I encountered a ghost. I honestly don't know what happened. I only know what I experienced. I slowly woke before my alarm. I felt someone standing quietly in the corner near my bedroom door. I believed it was my mother checking on me. When I opened my eyes, the room was empty. Moments later, I found my mother asleep so deeply that it took repeated attempts just to wake her enough to answer a simple question. After that morning, nothing similar ever happened again. No mysterious figures, no strange sensations, no unexplained presences. Just that one experience that has remained with me ever since. Even now, when I think back on it, I don't immediately remember fear. I remember confusion. I remember standing in the hallway, wondering how I could have been so certain someone had been in my room, and I remember my mother slowly waking from such a deep sleep that it became impossible to believe she'd been standing beside my bedroom only moments earlier. Whether the experience was simply a vivid moment between sleep and wakefulness, or something I'll never fully understand, is a question I've never been able to answer. All these years later, it remains one of the few moments in my life that still resists any explanation I can say with complete confidence. Sometimes I lean toward the scientific explanation. Other times, especially when I think about how soon it happened after losing my grandfather, I find myself wondering if there was more to it. The truth is, I'll probably never know. All I know is that one quiet June morning, just before my alarm was due to ring, I was absolutely convinced that someone was standing silently in my room. When I finally opened my eyes, there was no one there. And despite looking for an answer immediately afterward, I never found one. A few years ago, one of my friends and I decided to rent a duplex together. It seemed like the perfect arrangement at the time. The place had plenty of character, enough space for both of us, and it was surprisingly affordable. The building itself was old, very old. It had been standing for well over 100 years, and you could tell the moment you walked inside. The original woodwork was still there. The floors creaked with almost every step, and the walls had that unmistakable feeling that only historic buildings seem to have. Like many old homes, it made noises that newer houses simply don't. Pipes clicked. Floorboards settled. Doors shifted slightly with changes in temperature. Most of the time, we didn't think much of it. We joked that the house was just showing its age. Our bedrooms were on different levels. My roommate had the bedroom upstairs on the second floor, while I stayed in the bedroom downstairs. For the first little while, everything was perfectly normal. Then one night, something happened that neither of us forgot. I don't remember exactly what time it was, but it was already late, and we'd both gone to bed. I was downstairs, either asleep or just about to fall asleep, when I suddenly heard someone coming down the stairs much faster than usual. A moment later, my bedroom door opened. It was my roommate. She looked genuinely shaken. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't trying to scare me. She looked honestly frightened. After she managed to calm down enough to speak, she told me what had happened. She said she had been lying in bed when she suddenly felt the unmistakable sensation of someone climbing into bed beside her. Not simply the mattress shifting, not the house settling. She described it as feeling exactly like another person physically getting into bed. She felt the movement. She felt the weight. It was enough to make her jump up and run downstairs immediately. Hearing her describe it gave me chills. At the same time, I tried to think of ordinary explanations. Old mattresses can shift unexpectedly. Our minds can misinterpret sensations when we're drifting off to sleep. There are well-documented sleep phenomena where people experience incredibly realistic physical sensations while transitioning between sleep and wakefulness. I know that now. But in that moment, seeing how frightened she was made it difficult to dismiss her experience outright. Rather than simply telling her it was her imagination, I decided to go upstairs with her. Looking back, this may not have been my smartest decision. At the time, I had recently started learning about tarot cards. I was still very much a beginner. I knew enough to perform simple readings, but not enough to fully understand everything I was doing. I also didn't have much sense of self-preservation when it came to things that might be considered paranormal. Instead of leaving well enough alone, I grabbed my tarot deck and followed her upstairs. The room itself looked completely ordinary. Nothing appeared out of place. The bed looked exactly as it always had. The air didn't feel noticeably different. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Still, because of what my roommate had described, I decided to do something that, in hindsight, was probably driven more by curiosity than wisdom. I sat down with my tarot cards. Half joking and half serious, I spoke aloud. I asked whether there was any spirit present that wanted to communicate. Again, I realize how strange that probably sounds. Whether someone believes tarot is a meaningful spiritual practice, a psychological tool, or simply a deck of symbolic cards, I understand there are many different perspectives. At the time, though, I was curious. I shuffled the deck. Then I pulled the first card. Death. For anyone unfamiliar with tarot, the death card isn't usually interpreted as predicting a literal death. More often, it's associated with endings, transformation, and major change. Even knowing that, seeing it appear first in that particular situation immediately caught my attention. Trying not to overreact, I pulled a second card. The Devil. That stopped me in my tracks. Like the death card, the devil has symbolic meanings that don't necessarily refer to anything supernatural. It often represents temptation, unhealthy attachments, fear, or feeling trapped, rather than an actual evil presence. Still, considering the question I just asked and what had happened only minutes earlier, the combination felt incredibly unsettling. Even if you don't believe tarot cards have any supernatural significance, it's hard to deny that drawing those two cards back to back in those circumstances makes for a memorable coincidence. I remember looking over at my roommate. She looked just as unnerved as I felt. Neither of us really knew what to say after that. I don't remember trying to continue the reading. I think we both had enough. Eventually, we put the cards away and tried to settle down for the night. I honestly don't remember whether either of us slept particularly well afterward. Over the years, I've thought about that night many times. I've also learned much more about tarot than I knew back then. Today I understand that every card carries a wide range of symbolic meanings. Neither death nor the devil automatically represents something sinister. In fact, experienced tarot readers often view those cards in far less frightening ways than beginners do. Knowing that gives me a more balanced perspective now than I had at the time. I've also learned more about sleep-related experiences. Many people report vivid sensations of someone sitting on their bed, lying beside them, or even touching them while they're in states between sleeping and waking. These experiences can feel astonishingly real and are often associated with sleep paralysis or related sleep phenomena. That's another entirely reasonable explanation. It's certainly possible that my roommate experienced something along those lines without realizing it. At the same time, it's also true that our tarot reading happened exactly as I remember it. The first two cards I drew were Death and the Devil. Whether that was pure coincidence, subconscious pattern recognition, or something more meaningful depends entirely on how someone chooses to interpret tarot. I don't claim to know the answer. Looking back now, I can laugh a little at my younger self. If someone told me today they believed there might be a spirit in their bedroom, my first instinct probably wouldn't be to walk upstairs carrying a deck of tarot cards and start asking questions. At the time, though, curiosity got the better of me. I genuinely wanted to know whether anything unusual was happening. Instead, I walked away with an experience that has stayed in my memory ever since. Whenever people ask whether I've ever experienced anything that felt paranormal, this is one of the first stories that comes to mind. Not because I can prove anything supernatural occurred. I can't. There are perfectly reasonable explanations for both my roommate's experience and the tarot reading. Sleep-related sensations are well documented. Tarot cards are interpreted very differently depending on the reader, and unlikely combinations naturally happen from time to time. I recognize all of that. Even so, it's difficult to forget the atmosphere of that night. An old duplex. A frightened roommate convinced someone had climbed into bed beside her. A beginner with a tarot deck asking questions they probably shouldn't have been asking. And the first two cards appearing one after the other. Death. Then, the Devil. Whether it was coincidence, symbolism, psychology, or something that can't easily be explained, I honestly don't know. All I know is that the experience left both of us unsettled. And even years later, whenever I think back to that old 100-year-old duplex, that's the first memory that comes to mind. It wasn't the creaking floors or the age of the building that made the strongest impression. It was the look on my roommate's face when she ran downstairs, convinced someone had climbed into bed with her, followed by one of the most unforgettable tarot pulls I've ever had. To this day, I still can't say with certainty what happened that night. Maybe it was nothing more than an extraordinary coincidence. Or maybe it was one of those experiences that simply leaves you wondering long after you've stopped looking for answers. When I worked at Big Bend National Park, I became fascinated with the wildlife that lived out there. One of the animals everyone talked about was the mountain lion, or panther, as most people around the park called it. Sightings were incredibly rare, but every now and then someone would catch a glimpse of one crossing a road or disappearing into the desert. Those stories were enough to make me want to see one for myself. Eventually, I decided I was going to improve my chances. I bought a pair of night vision goggles. At the time, I thought it was one of the coolest purchases I'd ever made. My plan was simple: head out after dark and quietly observe a panther in its natural habitat. I imagined watching one move through the desert from a safe distance and getting an experience that very few people ever have. It sounded like a great idea. Looking back now, it was one of the dumbest things I've ever done. I was living in Panther Junction inside the park at the time. Behind the housing area was a wash that cut through the landscape, almost like a small canyon, appropriately called Panther Canyon. The name wasn't just for decoration. Park staff had seen mountain lions in the area more than once, and there was a den nearby that several people believed was actively being used. Sightings weren't common, but they happened often enough that everyone knew the cats were around. A friend and I had planned to go together one night. The idea was that we'd head out after dark, use the night vision goggles, stay a respectful distance away, and hopefully catch a glimpse of one of the cats. The problem was that my friend got completely drunk before we were supposed to leave. He wasn't going anywhere. Instead of calling the whole thing off like any sensible person would have done, I decided I'd just go by myself. That decision still makes me laugh now, mostly because I can't believe I actually thought it was a good idea. So there I was, walking alone into Panther Canyon in the middle of the night. No flashlight, just the night vision goggles. The desert at night feels completely different than it does during the day. During daylight, you can see for miles. The landscape feels open and almost empty. At night, everything changes. The darkness seems to close in around you. Every bush becomes a shadow. Every rock looks like it could be hiding something. Even with the goggles, it felt like I was walking through another world. At first, I was excited. The night vision worked incredibly well. I could make out the terrain, the plants, and the dry wash stretching ahead of me. Everything had that strange green glow that makes you feel like you're in a military movie. I remember thinking how awesome the goggles were. Then I started getting closer to the den. That's when the excitement slowly turned into something else. The closer I got, the quieter everything became. There wasn't much wind, no birds, no obvious movement, just complete silence. I stopped at what I believed was a safe distance from the den. I stood there scanning the area through the goggles, expecting to eventually spot the panther wandering around somewhere nearby. I kept thinking to myself, where is this thing? I looked around for several minutes. Nothing, no glowing eyes, no movement, no cat, just empty desert. But something didn't feel right. It's hard to explain. There was no specific sound or sight that scared me. It was more like a feeling that suddenly settled over me. That unmistakable sensation that something knew I was there. Anyone who spent enough time outdoors probably knows the feeling I'm talking about. Sometimes your instincts start screaming long before your brain can explain why. I suddenly realized something that should have been painfully obvious from the beginning. I was looking for a nocturnal predator. At night, near its den. Alone, the entire plan had one massive flaw that somehow hadn't occurred to me until that exact moment. I was trying to find an animal that was specifically built to hunt in darkness. Meanwhile, I was stumbling around making plenty of noise. That mountain lion almost certainly knew I was there long before I had any chance of seeing it. It could probably hear me. It could definitely smell me. For all I know, it had been watching me the entire time while I stood there wondering where it was. That realization hit me like a truck. Instead of feeling like the hunter, I suddenly realized I was the one being observed. I couldn't see the cat. But there was a very good chance the cat could see me perfectly. Every instinct in my body started telling me it was time to leave. Then I heard it. A rustle in the brush. Not loud, not dramatic. Just enough movement to remind me I wasn't alone. That was all it took. Every ounce of confidence I had disappeared instantly. I turned around and took off. I wasn't trying to preserve my dignity anymore. I wasn't trying to quietly observe wildlife. I wasn't pretending to be some experienced tracker. I ran, fast, the entire way back toward my trailer. Every few seconds I felt like something was going to come flying out of the darkness behind me. I kept imagining hearing paws on the ground. I expected to feel something jump onto my back at any second. Nothing ever did. But my imagination was working overtime. By the time I reached my trailer, my heart was pounding. I probably looked ridiculous. I slammed the door behind me, locked it, and stood there catching my breath while realizing just how stupid the whole idea had been. The funny part is that I never actually saw the panther. Not once. That's probably because it had absolutely no reason to let me see it. Mountain lions are masters of staying hidden. If one decides you aren't a threat, or that you're not worth the effort, you'll probably never know it was there. Looking back, I honestly hope that's exactly what happened. I hope the cat watched me walk into its territory, silently judged my terrible life choices, and then watched me sprint back out without ever bothering to reveal itself. That would honestly be the best possible outcome. Working at Big Bend gave me an enormous amount of respect for wildlife, especially predators. People often underestimate animals because they don't see them. But not seeing a mountain lion doesn't mean one isn't nearby. In fact, if there's one lesson I took away from that night, it's probably the exact opposite. If you're wandering around near a known mountain lion den in complete darkness, there's a decent chance the animal already knows exactly where you are. You just don't know where it is. And that's a very uncomfortable position to be in. To this day, I still think the night vision goggles were awesome. They worked exactly as advertised. The problem wasn't the equipment. The problem was the person wearing them. I somehow convinced myself that buying a pair of expensive goggles meant I was prepared to walk into the territory of one of North America's most effective ambush predators. Turns out, no amount of technology makes up for common sense. It's funny now because nothing actually happened. No mountain lion chased me. Nothing attacked me. I made it back completely unharmed. But I've never forgotten that overwhelming feeling of standing in complete silence, staring at a panther den, wondering where the cat was, only to realize the far more important question wasn't where the panther was. It was how long the panther had been watching me. One real event that has stayed with me for years is the story of a lake that became a silent killer. I couldn't remember its name for the longest time, but the story itself was impossible to forget. For decades, the lake was slowly filling with carbon dioxide gas that came from deep beneath the earth. Because of volcanic activity underground, the gas continuously seeped into the bottom of the lake. Under the enormous pressure of the deep water, the carbon dioxide stayed dissolved instead of escaping into the air. Year after year, more and more of the gas collected at the bottom. Nothing looked unusual from the surface. The water appeared calm. The surrounding mountains were beautiful. Nearby villages carried on with everyday life, completely unaware that millions of tons of carbon dioxide were trapped beneath the lake. Then, one day, everything changed. Scientists believe a natural event, possibly a landslide or a small earthquake, disturbed the lake just enough to upset the delicate balance that had existed for years. The deep water suddenly rose toward the surface. As the pressure dropped, the dissolved carbon dioxide could no longer remain trapped in the water. It erupted out of the lake all at once. Imagine opening a bottle of soda after shaking it violently. The dissolved gas suddenly escapes in a rush of bubbles. The same basic process happened here, except instead of a bottle, it involved an entire lake. An enormous cloud of carbon dioxide burst out of the water and spilled over the edge of the lake. Unlike smoke, it couldn't be seen. Unlike natural gas, it had no smell to warn anyone. It made no loud sound as it spread through the surrounding valleys. Because carbon dioxide is heavier than ordinary air, it didn't rise into the sky. Instead, it hugged the ground. It slowly flowed downhill like an invisible river. The cloud crept through villages during the night, silently replacing the oxygen that people and animals needed to breathe. Most of the victims never realized anything was wrong. There was no warning. No obvious danger, no visible cloud racing toward them. People simply lost consciousness as the oxygen around them disappeared. Many died exactly where they had been moments earlier. Some were found in their beds, as though they had peacefully fallen asleep and never woken up. Others were discovered lying on footpaths or inside their homes. Livestock collapsed in fields. Wild animals died where they stood. Birds fell from the air. Entire villages were left eerily silent. When survivors from nearby areas eventually arrived, they were met with an almost unimaginable scene. There were no signs of violence, no fire, no flood, no explosion. Just people and animals lying motionless across the landscape, as though time itself had suddenly stopped. The event became known as the Lake Nyos disaster, which occurred in Cameroon on August 21, 1986. In just a matter of hours, the invisible cloud killed more than 1,700 people and thousands of animals. For many years afterward, scientists studied the disaster to understand exactly what had happened. They eventually confirmed that the lake had experienced what is now known as a limnic eruption, an extremely rare natural phenomenon in which dissolved carbon dioxide suddenly escapes from deep lake water in massive quantities. The disaster changed the way scientists monitor certain volcanic lakes around the world. Today, Lake Nyos has special degassing pipes installed to slowly release carbon dioxide before it can build up to dangerous levels again. By allowing the gas to escape gradually, the risk of another catastrophic eruption has been dramatically reduced. What makes the tragedy so haunting isn't just the number of lives that were lost. It's the nature of the disaster itself. The victims weren't running from danger. They weren't caught in a storm or trapped in a wildfire. They had no reason to panic because there was nothing to see. The thing that killed them was completely invisible. No color, no smell, no warning. Just a silent cloud slowly moving downhill through the darkness, replacing the air with something that couldn't support life. It's one of the few natural disasters where the danger was almost impossible for ordinary people to recognize until it was far too late. Even today, it's difficult to imagine something so ordinary looking. A peaceful mountain lake surrounded by beautiful scenery, hiding enough gas beneath its surface to wipe out entire communities in a single night. The Lake Nyos disaster remains one of the strangest and most unsettling natural tragedies in modern history, because it reminds us that some of the deadliest forces in nature don't arrive with thunder, flames, or crashing waves. Sometimes they arrive in complete silence. An invisible cloud drifted down a mountainside while people slept, and by the time the sun rose the next morning, entire villages had been transformed into ghost towns. It remains one of the most chilling examples of how nature can become deadly without making a sound, and how a peaceful place can hide a danger that no one can see until it's already too late. Back in 2005, I knew a girl who suddenly stopped answering my phone calls and text messages. At first, I didn't think much of it. People missed calls all the time, and cell phones weren't nearly as reliable as they are today. But after a while, I started getting worried, because it wasn't like her to disappear without saying anything. Eventually, she finally answered. The moment she picked up, I could tell something was wrong. She sounded scared and told me she was locked inside a guy's dorm room at UMBC. She wasn't joking, and she definitely wasn't calm. Hearing that immediately put me on edge. I asked what had happened, but before I could get much of an explanation, I ended up talking directly to the guy. The conversation turned into an argument almost instantly. I told him I was on my way to campus, and if he was keeping her there against her will, we were going to have a serious problem. At that point, I wasn't really thinking things through. I was just angry and wanted to make sure she was okay. I got in my car and headed toward UMBC. While I was driving, she called me again and said she had managed to get out of the room. She told me where she was, and I picked her up. Once I knew she was safe, I wanted to go find the guy and confront him face to face. Looking back now, that probably wasn't the smartest idea. But adrenaline has a way of overriding common sense. She stopped me. She told me not to do it. Her exact reason stuck with me because it seemed unusual at the time. She said he was really creepy and that she didn't want me going anywhere near him. Since she was finally safe, I listened to her. We left, and I assumed that was the end of it. It wasn't. A few days later, something happened that made the whole situation much more unsettling. Out of nowhere, the guy somehow found me on AOL Instant Messenger, AIM, back when practically everyone used it. He started sending me threatening messages. At first I figured he was just trying to intimidate me because of our argument. But then he began mentioning personal information about me. He knew my full legal name. He knew where I live. Today that might not sound quite as shocking because so much information exists online, but this was 2005. Finding someone's personal details wasn't nearly as simple as it is now. Seeing him casually list my information immediately changed the tone of the conversation. Then the threats became even more serious. He said he was going to kill both me and the girl. At the time, I didn't believe him. I assumed he was just another internet tough guy trying to scare people from behind a keyboard. We had all seen people make ridiculous threats online, and I figured this was no different. Instead of backing down, I called his bluff. I told him that if he wanted to meet in person, I'd be ready. Looking back now, that was probably an incredibly reckless response. At the time, though, I honestly believed he was all talk. After that exchange, I never heard from him again. Life moved on. Then, only a few weeks later, I saw something on the news that completely changed the way I thought about the entire situation. A young woman had gone on a date with a man she met through MySpace. She never came home. Police eventually discovered that she had been murdered. Investigators later revealed that she had also been sexually assaulted, and the killer had attempted to mutilate her body in an effort to make identification more difficult. As details of the investigation were released, one name immediately caught my attention. It was the same guy. The same person who had locked my friend inside his dorm room. The same person who had argued with me over the phone. The same person who had tracked me down on AIM. The same person who had threatened to kill both of us. I remember staring at the news in complete disbelief. Suddenly, every message he had sent me felt different. Those weren't empty threats from some random internet troll. They had come from someone who was genuinely capable of extreme violence. The victim was identified as 21-year-old Leslie Ann Preer, and investigators arrested John Gaumer for the crime. During the investigation, authorities uncovered evidence linking him to the murder, and rather than face a possible death sentence at trial, he eventually pleaded guilty and accepted a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The media later referred to him as the MySpace killer because he had met his victim through the social networking site. I still think back to that week from time to time. At the time, I felt frustrated because my friend wouldn't let me confront him. Now, I'm incredibly grateful she did. Had I gone looking for him that night, I have no idea how things might have turned out. It's impossible to know whether anything would have happened or whether it simply would have been another argument. But knowing what he eventually did to someone else makes it clear that he wasn't just an angry college student acting tough. He was a genuinely dangerous individual. It's also unsettling to think about how easily I dismissed his threats. Like a lot of people back then, I assumed that anyone making violent claims online was probably just trying to get attention. Most of the time, that assumption was true. This time, it wasn't. Those AIM messages seemed almost laughable when I first received them. After his arrest, I realized they could have been warning signs. The whole experience completely changed the way I look at online threats. Most people who make them never act on them, but every now and then, someone does. The difficult part is that you usually can't tell which is which until it's too late. Whenever I remember that story now, I don't think about the argument or the messages nearly as much as I think about how close my friend may have come to becoming another victim herself. She trusted her instincts, got out of that room, and insisted we leave instead of escalating the situation. That decision may have protected both of us. A few weeks later, another young woman wasn't nearly as fortunate. Knowing that someone who once threatened both of us would soon go on to commit such a horrific crime is something that stayed with me ever since. It's one of those moments that permanently changes the way you think about danger, intuition, and the people we sometimes underestimate.